with Connell that also helped a lot with organizing the event here on European grids that we published today. But the discussion on the demand side is often more muted, probably also because it's more complex and more heterogeneous. And just a clear example for that is, in my view, that on the one hand, some in the industry are complaining about too low development of electricity demand to merit all these increases in capacities, in grid capacities, in generation capacities. On the other hand, we have some consumers that are complaining about too high prices, and they worry also that connecting new installations, data centers, but also maintaining existing demand in Europe will be very difficult. And we think if we want to have a consistent vision about our decarbonisation pathway, it's quite useful to try to focus on demand in a session, and it will be very difficult because in the end it's all connected, of course, to the grids and the supply issue. But I will try my best to keep the discussion focused really on what happens on the demand side, what can we do to get an efficient development of electricity demand in Europe, what policies might be needed here, and to which degree maybe some demand is more useful and more valuable than other demand. So for that, we have a very, in my view, great panel that can speak to all of those aspects. First, we have Pamela McDougall, just to be sure on pronouncing the name correctly. She is head of energy regulation at Amazon Web Services, so one of the big data center companies in the world. We have Christoph Maurer. He is managing director at Consentec, which is a consultancy in Germany that is very closely consulting also the German government on long-term scenarios and knows especially the German system extremely well. We have Lukasz Kolinski. He is Director for Green Transition and Energy System Integration at the European Commission. So he is essentially responsible for the electricity part of the European Commission. And we have Marion Labatou. She is Director of EU Affairs at EDF here in Brussels, and EDF being kind of one of the major utilities in Europe. Now, the agenda for today is the following. We will have two kind of slightly longer introductory statements by Pamela and Christoph for about 10 minutes each, and then we have comments from Lukasz and Marion, and then I would organize a bit of a panel discussion, and then we open the floor to questions from the audience. So, Pamela, why don't you start? Yeah, please.
Can everyone hear me? I want to thank very much Bruegel for inviting me here today. I'm Pamela McDougall, and as Amazon Web Services Head of Energy Regulation, I lead our efforts in Europe to help policymakers build a stable regulatory framework, one that can deliver a future-ready energy system capable of delivering twin, digital, and decarbonized transition. My experience spans electrification, carbon-free energy, grid modernization, and resiliency, all elements that are critical to today's discussion. Having worked in the energy sector globally for the past 17 years, I've never seen a more crucial and exciting time to work on the energy transition. Let me start by sharing how Amazon is contributing to this transition. We recognize that our scale brings both opportunity and responsibility. Our employees, customers, and partners expect us to lead on sustainability, which is exactly why we co-founded the Climate Pledge, committing to becoming net zero carbon by 2040, 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement. We believe it's important that large companies like Amazon stimulate investment in the development of green technologies and low-carbon products and services that will be required to help companies of all sizes decarbonize their operations. I'm proud to share that in 2023, we matched all electricity used by our operations with 100% renewable energy, achieving this milestone 7 years ahead of schedule. For 5 consecutive years now, Amazon has been the largest corporate purchaser of carbon-free energy in Europe and globally, and we've supported over 600 wind and solar projects worldwide, with more than 230 of these projects right here in Europe. But it's not just about the numbers. We're also strategic about where we place these projects, focusing on grids that rely heavily on carbon-intensive energy sources. This way, each project has maximum impact on emission reductions. With regards to electrification, we've committed to spend €1 billion on further electrifying our transport network over the next few years in Europe. But we're also evolving our approach to data center growth. AWS is thoughtful about where and how we expand, ensuring our business demand not only avoids negative impacts on the energy system, but actively supports a low-cost energy transition in Europe. Just over 5 years ago, the European Union presented its Green Deal, which has shown remarkable success in particularly accelerating renewable deployment. As we enter this new EU political mandate, the conversation has shifted to what measures need to be put in place to make this transition happen. In particular, focusing on electrification, which we'll be discussing further today, grid infrastructure, competitiveness, and managing the emerging energy demands of AI. Looking forward, we're particularly excited about the forthcoming Clean Industrial Deal from the Commission later this month. This will be crucial in setting the path for sustainable industrial growth and ensuring the EU maintains its competitive edge in the digital sector. If you've been following the AI Action Summit this week, you'll know that energy efficiency has been a central focus of discussions. While AI is transforming how we address global issues, we recognize the importance of minimizing its environmental footprint. Our research shows that our data centers are up to 4 times more energy efficient than traditional on-premise facilities. That's not just good for business, it's good for the planet. Speaking about broader societal benefits, our recent study with Telecom Advisory Services, which looked at 15 European countries, found that a 10% increase in cloud adoption enhanced energy productivity by $9.2 per megawatt hour. To put this in economic terms, this contributes to an estimated €34 billion to European GDP through reduced production costs and increased reinvestment in innovation. As we strive towards increasing European competitiveness, this study confirms that digital technologies like AI are essential to that effort and do help make the most of investments in energy infrastructure to benefit the economy and society. The Commission President has been vocal about her ambition to make the EU a global leader in AI innovation and promote investment in Europe. When AWS thinks about where to invest and grow our operations, it is important for us that we have clarity on grid capacity timelines. This isn't just about when we connect, it helps inform where we locate facilities and how we plan renewable energy projects. As we're all aware, alongside the digital sector boom, the energy sector is undergoing massive transformation with rapid electrification of transportation and heating, as well as accelerated deployment of clean energy projects. To ensure success across these industries, grid infrastructure investments must keep pace with the demand growth. As a result of these changes, on-the-ground companies are experiencing increasing connection delays and uncertainty about when capacity will become available. This makes it incredibly difficult for businesses to plan and execute their growth strategies. Based on our experience, we believe there are 4 essential actions needed to enable Europeans' twin transition, and let me walk you through them. Firstly, we need to enable proactive grid investment based on future growth projections. We can't wait for demand to materialize before we act. We're already seeing some promising approaches where utilities and customers share investment risks, but we need to scale these solutions. Second, we must tackle the energy infrastructure permitting challenge head-on. The EU Grid Action Plan provides an excellent framework, but implementation is key. We need to move from talking about streamlining to actually making it happen on the ground. Third, we need to revolutionize how we handle grid connections. The current system simply isn't fit for purpose to handle the sheer number of applications that utilities are facing every day. Policies which improve efficiency of connection processing, as well as finding solutions to ensure real projects and not speculative ones are being prioritized, will be key to ensuring competitiveness in the EU. And finally, grid modernization isn't just about putting copper in the ground, it's about making our infrastructure smarter and efficient. Digital technologies can help us squeeze more capacity out of existing infrastructure while improving reliability and reducing energy costs for everyone. Getting the right regulatory framework in place will enable amazing things to support energy decarbonization. There are also exciting developments with how AI and the Internet of Things are transforming our energy system. This isn't future technology, it's happening right now on the ground, and the results are pretty remarkable. Take, for example, our partnership with Iberdrola. By implementing AWS's machine learning solutions, they've achieved energy consumption reductions of 10 to 30% for their customers. That's real money back in customers' pockets while addressing grid congestion issues. What's particularly exciting about how AI is helping grid operators is how they can manage the complexity of our evolving system. Think about the challenge of balancing thousands of renewable energy sources, storage systems, flexible loads. It's simply beyond human capability, and AI makes this possible real time. We're also seeing grid operators across the globe use these technologies to predict maintenance needs before failures occur, optimize power flows to reduce losses, and integrate more renewable energy than we've ever thought possible. And we're just scratching the surface with what these technologies can do. As these technologies mature, they're becoming more accessible to utilities of all sizes. And let's not forget, more efficient use of energy means we can grow Europe's digital economy while maintaining our environmental impact. This is crucial as we work to meet Europe's climate goals while maintaining industrial leadership. Let me wrap up by emphasizing what's at stake here. Modernized grids are absolutely essential for accelerating both digital transformation and Europe's path to decarbonization. Amazon is fully committed to supporting EU energy transformation, and we're backing this commitment with continued investment in renewable energy and digital infrastructure. With the right support, Europe's power grids can become the backbone of a more sustainable, digital, and dynamic European landscape. Thank you for your attention today, and I'm genuinely excited to dive into this discussion with an impressive group of energy experts, so thank you.
Many thanks, Pamela. I found it extremely useful because it's a perspective that typically in energy policy discussions in Brussels, I very rarely hear that from essentially electricity demand side, but also from a new sector that is just trying to define a bit how the energy demand of the future in Europe could potentially look like. So location, grid connection. So it's not about the incumbent demand that we try to meet, but it's about the upcoming new types of demand. And obviously it goes on top of what we initially had in mind when we are thinking about electrification, of trying to switch houses and cars from fossil fuels to electricity, but an essentially new sector. I think in the discussion would be very good to pick deeper into some of the issues you mentioned on efficiency of data centers and how that is measured in terms of location and potentially also in terms of flexibility of the demand that can come from data centers in order to play its role. And another point I found very noteworthy and useful was your kind of phrasing it as a bit of sharing the investment risk of the demand and supply side, if I understood you correctly. So a bit the synchronization between you don't want to go there first with demand and wait until you get a grid connection, the producer and the grid people don't want to go there and have the risk, and finding new ways to synchronize and share this risk. I think this is a very important point in order to get to the speedy increase of kind of your businesses, but also on the supply side. With that, I think going now to a more kind of conventional view on the electricity sector. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georg. So I hope I can get this working now. I'm too fast, obviously. Welcome from my side. I'm Christoph Maurer. I'm the head of Consentec, which is a German-based energy consultancy. So we're working on electricity markets, power systems, power grids, doing a lot of advisory work on electricity market design, but also doing significant energy system modeling. So we also have a large modeling department. I brought some data from one of our projects to you today, and would like to start with comparing actual consumption, actual electricity demand in Germany over the last 5 years compared to scenarios. That's what we call in Germany long-term scenarios or Langfrist-Szenarien, which is a study which is was commissioned by the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and this is some kind of pathway study, if you want. So we're exploring pathways to a climate-neutral energy system there, and are working on what is needed in terms of electrification, in terms of grids, and so on. So how could a climate-neutral future until 2045 look like? And one very important aspect of that climate-neutral future is electrification and a significant increase in electricity demand. And I think it's worthwhile to compare the, let's say, the forecasts or the projections of electricity demand. Yeah, it's not actually a forecast, it's rather a projection what would be needed to achieve our climate targets, and compare that with the actual consumption. And just to be clear here, I'm the one to blame also for these forecasts, because we were part of that research group who did the calculations. Nevertheless, if we're looking at actual consumption and these scenarios, there's a significant gap here. So we are now, let's say, little bit above 500 terawatt hours of electricity consumption, gross electricity consumption in Germany, and for 2025 in our scenarios, and that's the latest issue which was published last year, we had something like 550, and we had roughly 750 to 800 terawatt hours for 2030 as gross electricity consumption, which would be needed in order to, let's say, get the decarbonisation done. So a significant shift of industrial energy consumption towards electricity, but also from transportation, from heating, and so on. Looking at these numbers, it seems not really realistic any longer, at least on the short run. So we won't have an increase of electricity consumption of 50 terawatt hours this year, and we won't have another 200 terawatt hours until 2030. And what will happen later on still is a little bit unclear, which is especially important because this long-term scenario study and similar studies, but this one in particular, is, for example, used in order to create scenarios for the network development plans in Germany. So network planning somehow is based on these projections. The same is true for REST support schemes. So we have REST support schemes and targets there which are somehow based on these projections. So we're aiming at let's say, getting the electricity supply to cover that projected electricity consumption. We are getting close to building the grids for that. It's still somehow stuck, but it's getting better, and permits are significantly increasing. So we really hope to let's say, get grid expansion going over the next few years. But if at the same time electricity demand is stuck and does not increase, we get a significant problem for, let's say, recovering the cost for these investments, because somehow electricity consumers will have to pay for the electricity system. And if demand is not rising, this will mean that the costs per kilowatt hour will increase significantly, which could be, let's say, a real problem for competitiveness and productivity. Now that's an issue, and the question is now what to do. I think it's first, it helps to think about, will it only be, let's say, a delay in an increase of electricity demand, or are we expecting now a significantly lower electricity demand than, for example, 2 or 3 years ago? And I think it's some kind of both aspects. I'm totally convinced that electrification of final electricity demand will come. But there are no significant alternatives to electrification there. We will have significant increase of electricity demand of digitization, and because of digitization of data centers, we heard that now. But also the transportation sector, there is no real alternative for let's say, land-bound transportation to electrification, and even in let's say, heavyweight transportation, the trend is clearly towards electrification, but it's slower than we expected it to be. And also for space heating, and I linked a study here we did for the Commission 1 or 2 years ago. Even in space heating, there's no real alternative to direct or indirect electrification. Though at the end, there will be a significantly higher final electricity demand, but it may take longer than expected, which is a problem for synchronizing it with grids and renewables expansion and so on. But there is some significant uncertainty too, I think two aspects where I'm, let's say, less certain today than I was 2 or 3 years ago about the increase in electricity demand is the electricity consumption of energy-intensive industries. I'm hesitant today, at least, to say that energy-intensive industries will stay in Europe, or at least in Germany, where they play a major role today. I think that there might be a significant shift toward other regions of the world, potentially within Europe, which would be, let's say, an advantage compared to losing them totally. But I don't see that energy-intensive industries will be competitive, at least with expected German electricity prices on the long run. And another problem, which is also somehow linked to electricity prices, is the question of domestic production of hydrogen. So in these scenarios, we had, for example, some 200 terawatt hours or something like that of electricity consumption for production of hydrogen. And I'm no longer sure that this will happen. So hydrogen somehow, well, it was a bubble some years ago, and the bubble seems to have burst now, which does not mean that today's pessimism will also last for forever. I think it will somehow, the hydrogen demand will recover, or the projections will recover, but it will be potentially lower than expected 2 years ago or something like that. So I think we'll have to deal with the fact that these 1,000 or 1,300 terawatt hours or something like that, which we had on the slide before, might not happen. It might be 1,100 or something like that, perhaps, but that will have significant impacts on the electricity system. And the question now is how to deal with that. And I'd argue that we need some kind of smart electrification strategy for the EU. So we should, let's say, get rid of all barriers for electrification, because clearly electrification is the way to go. But on the other hand, there are also some things I personally, at least, would not recommend to do. And for the remainder of that presentation, I just would like to introduce you to some, let's say, do's and don'ts from my perspective, just perhaps also to foster discussion later on. I'm quite aware that you might not share all my positions here, but I think we'll have a more lively discussion if you know where I'm standing there and what is in my mind. So, as mentioned, we should clearly get rid of all barriers to electrification. This means we should reduce taxes on electricity to the minimum possible level, which is, for example, in Germany not yet happening, though they reduce taxes for manufacturing industries, but not for other electricity consumers. We should actually and urgently adapt RES support schemes in a way to incentivize valuable production instead of the total volume of production. So today, RES support schemes often incentivize, let's say, production of electricity which has no value. So look at solar PV production during summer times at negative prices, for example, often incentivized by support schemes. We need to get prices right. I think that's a very, very important point, because we will have to have a more flexible electricity system in order to deal with that electrification issues and make electrification as cheap as possible. And millions and millions of active electricity consumers, even on household level, so those millions of prosumers we will have, they need some signal to coordinate them, and that signal can only be a price signal. There's no other mechanism to coordinate these consumers than prices, and that means that we will have to get prices right. We will also have to think about, let's say, higher levels of cross-border cooperation here. For example, in regarding RES expansion, where we should really aim at building RES where they're cheapest in Europe, which also means that we have to think about a cost-sharing mechanism for the related infrastructure. So we won't get cheap renewables from, let's say, somewhere in Spain, in Germany, if there's no way to also recover the cost for the infrastructure to transport that electricity, for example. We need some joint strategy on EU level, in my eyes, for resource adequacy instead of national capacity remuneration mechanisms, which have a lot of let's say, biases and problems. We need a smart grid expansion strategy. Pamela mentioned we should build grids now. We should not wait until, let's say, demand emerges. I agree with that. We should aim at getting the permits done and so on. But at the same time, we also need flexible strategies, let's say, to shift really realizing and spending the money if electrification does not matter or materialize yet, and something like that. So if not, we will risk that grids are getting ever more expensive, and that would also be bad for electrification. There's some other aspects like forward markets, like simplifying the requirements of the RFNBO Delegated Act, for example, which would be helpful in my eyes, and also getting rid of all subsidies which still exist for fossil energies in the EU. But on the other hand, there are also measures that are under discussion now from what I get, where I'm not yet convinced that we should aim at realizing them. I have two groups here, because I promised you I have do's and don'ts. And the first group are measures which might be debatable, but where at least I think it's necessary to weigh the pros and cons, and there are significant trade-offs in my eyes. So these are not no-regret measures like the ones on the other slide from my perspective, but ones which really need thorough investigation before realizing them. Which might, for example, be prolonging the cost recovery period for grid expansions. That's a measure which seems to be very popular now. So we had it in Germany for the hydrogen network, which is to be built. It's quite understandable there, because there we have huge investments at the beginning, and demand will materialize only later. So I can see the sense of prolonging the cost recovery period there. I'm less convinced of doing that with power networks. So where we have congestion today, I think it doesn't really make sense to shift cost recovery to future generations, for example. Subsidizing grids from fiscal budgets is a thing which is also discussed now in Germany and the new government. So if we get one, hopefully next week. But the new government might very well agree on somehow subsidizing costs from the budget, which has pros and cons. The distributive effects might be better than that of grid tariffs, but on the other hand, there might also be significant uncertainties with regard to let's say, future payments and so on. Subsidizing energy incentive industries, at least if we have to do that permanently, in my eyes, might be, well, not that recommendable. And handing out government-backed guarantees for long-term contracts, which is now in the electricity market design regulation as one possibility, at least has to be defined or done at, let's say, at market level or at market price level, so it shouldn't be a subsidy. But nevertheless, these are all measures which are debatable and could help electrification if done properly. And there are other ones which I personally would not recommend doing, and hopefully they won't be pursued. But nevertheless, I'm still worried. I think that the idea of changing the pricing mechanism in short-term electricity markets is gaining traction again in Brussels from my perspective. So I was very happy that we got through the electricity market design reform without actually endangering the functioning of short-term electricity markets. But I'm a little bit worried that it might come up again. With the idea of reducing electricity prices, I don't think that would be a favorable thing to do. I would strongly oppose capping prices, obviously, that would be even worse. And I'm also a little bit worried that given the idea that we now should lower the barriers to state aid, for example, and so on, and also given the dangers from, let's say, global trade conflicts, we might enter intra-EU subsidy race, so that EU member states might compete for subsidies for their energy-intensive industries, and that could, in my eyes, be a very, very bad outcome. So if member states would spend a lot of money from their budgets in order to incentivize, let's say, companies not to go to another EU country or something like that. So hopefully we can avoid that. And I'd stop here, just to spark some discussion, hopefully, and with that list of do's and don'ts. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Christoph. I think you didn't disappoint in terms of provocation. My main takeaway is still from the first two slides, in the sense of we really have an issue that we do not see electricity demand to grow as fast as many our plans on the supply side are kind of underlie. So we have network development plans that are built on projection of very high demand growers. We have ideas about underwriting renewables deployment based on demand projections that might turn out wrong. And overall, for me, the big story in all this is synchronization. And I think you both mentioned that. So how do we synchronize the demand side, the supply side, and the grid side in a meaningful way? I think what you were essentially pushing for was try to find as many market tools as possible, as many price tools as possible in the short term and in the long term to organize this synchronization of the different demand actors, the different supply actors, and the network actors to get to an efficient system. I think it is still a very open debate on whether we are willing to go there, because it always seems much more attractive to single out individual sectors where one knows better than the market and what to do. But I think we can come to that discussion afterwards. Now, with that, I would like to give over to Lukasz Kolinski, and would be very keen to hear what is maybe brewing in the Commission on that, and your reflections on the question of too sluggish electricity demand. Is it an issue? Is it something that is actually good for prices?
Thanks a lot for having me here, and thanks a lot for these opening speeches, which I think have made a lot of points that are on our radar screen already. You know what's brewing. What's brewing is the Clean Industrial Deal, the Affordable Energy Action Plan, but that, please bear with me. For this, you will need to wait a little bit longer. But I think a few points that were raised here, and then of course, a few months later, beginning of next year, we will have a dedicated, I think, Electrification Action Plan. But now, a few perhaps reflections on what was said. First of all, also at the European level, you see stagnation of electrification, right? For years. And this is not obviously good, given that electrification is also seen by us as the first way for decarbonisation, increasing efficiency as well, and therefore, as you know, we want to act on this. Now you want to discuss demand, but I think, and you have just said it, I think it's very difficult to speak about demand without discussing supply of electricity and without discussing this interface being grids and being flexibility. Why? Because, sometimes when we discuss demand for electricity, new demand, etc., people kind of forget that, well, if the supply doesn't catch up with this additional demand, that will have the impact on prices. So from my perspective, as we are preparing the Affordable Energy Action Plan, and I will not repeat all the good arguments why we need more affordable energy or more affordable electricity, we want to be coherent in the Electrification Action Plan with that. So the road for electrification goes through affordable electricity and goes through more supply of cheap, clean electricity. That's one point. Abundant and affordable and clean. And then you already mentioned it. There is the interface, which is the grid's expansion, and I fully agree with you that we need to do more on this. You have all probably seen these eye-watering figures in terms of how much needs to be invested. 600 billion to 2030. I have seen also the figures of over 700 billion only at the distribution level, because most of these investments will have to happen there by 730, I think by 2040. So huge investments there. We need to simplify permitting very clearly. Sometimes I see that it takes 10, 12 years to build grid. I think that what we also need there is more integrated planning across the countries. We see that not only anticipatory investments, you mentioned them, and there is already work that started on this front, but we need, I think, in order to keep the costs in check, more European planning for grids. But then for me, there is this point that perhaps we mentioned, was flagged, but we didn't dwell into the flexibility. Because, on the one hand, we are not yet even on track towards the 2030 targets for renewables. So we're deploying, 70 gigas per year. We should be deploying around 100 to be on track. So overall, we are underachieving, but we see with the record number of negative price hours across the EU this year, and I bet last year, and I bet this year will be the same. We see that at times, at places, renewables are overly abundant, and we need to address this. And I think this is a very crucial point for the discussion on electrification of demand. Already today, I think, if you brought flexible demand in those places where you see the abundance of negative price hours, that would be good for business. You don't need to be supported by the state to do that. But that needs to be flexible demand, and that for me is a big question to the industry. It's a big question to companies that run data centers, how flexible your demand can be. Because if you heap the inflexible demand into the system right now, we might see actually more of the other thing that is happening more and more often across the EU, which are price spikes. In Germany in December, in autumn in Southeastern Europe, going up to 1,000 euros per megawatt hour. And that is something that obviously has immediate political consequences. What can the EU do about it? I think we can. You have kind of diagnosed the issues quite well. There is on flexibility. There is already on flexibility on renewables. You have already issues in the legislation. So I would start with implementation. I would say there are things that one can do on permitting of grids, on planning of grids. You have seen the announcement of the grid package. We can work on making the internal electricity market deeper, more efficient, and more integrated. There are still things that one could do on this. And we could help to drive investments. I mentioned permitting. Finally, I think we mentioned a bit less R&I here. There is quite a lot of funding going into R&I related to electrification, and I think this funding is being used pretty well. We see that the technologies that could help us electrify, for example, heat going up to 200 degrees or even more, they are mature. So there is a lot that has happened over the last years with limiting taxation, and I can sign off on this, with both hands, but you have seen what's going on in the council over the last few years on the energy taxation directive. I think, the message needs to be passed much more strongly towards the member states. And then finally, of course, we are ready to kind of help in with the financing of those most ambitious decarbonisation projects, bringing the projects over the line. But again, we need to use the market as much as possible. And I think we are really in a good place to push this line of electrification in the final energy consumption a bit higher. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks, Lukas. I think for me the main point of the several interesting points was that the focus on flexibility and the point that we are not only talking about terawatt hours, but that we are talking really about capacity, about situations in which you have wind and solar available, and location. So that demand is not just one number that we look into, but we really have to make sure that we get the right demand for what we can cheaply produce, and that we also build the right system for the demand that we are having. Marion, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm a bit sick, so bear with my Dark Vader voice. I think indeed that we need to look at the evolution of supply and demand in a consistent manner. And as our CEO put it last week, it's good if the supply is a little bit ahead of demand. If we can anticipate where it's going to go. It gets more complicated if we are lagging behind, because that will, of course, create price spikes. But it's also a problem if we are too much ahead, which is the case today in some member states. It is the case, it starts to be the case in France, for instance. So we need to have this coordination, but not overall with the bulk terawatt hours figures. Also, indeed, in terms of location, cross-border exchanges, and also in terms of the moment when we have lots of electricity and the moment when the consumption happens. And this brings us back as well to the flexibility discussion. I think it would be high time to bring this type of debates to the political level, maybe once a year in the Energy Council, have a discussion on what each member state is doing, because they have freedom to decide on their energy mix, but have a frank and open discussion on the impact of those choices. Positive impacts, but also impacts that need to be looked at and assessed and addressed. If we keep adding generation which produces in the middle of the day, then let's face it, and let's look at what is the flexibility needed, the storage needs, and how we can trigger more demand at this moment of the day. Otherwise, next year it's going to be again 4 times more negative pricing compared to 2024, and this will start to be lots of hours of negative prices. So, first of all, a call for a more political coordination and really talking about this, because otherwise you will have what's happening in Norway right now, which is basically almost an exit of Norway from our electricity system, governments falling over it. We saw as well during the Dunkelflaute in December how it became really heated between Sweden and Germany. So these are very strong political signals that we should address it at the highest level and with a frank discussion. Now looking at electrification, we see it slowly coming. It's going to come through the massification of electric vehicles, as you said, of heat pumps, because there is not much more alternative in terms of decarbonizing buildings. The more complicated part is indeed on industry, because that requires a tailor-made solution. Nevertheless, there are different areas, and we really see that there are low-hanging fruits and more easy to electrify sectors that we could tackle in the next few years with existing technologies such as industrial heat pumps, e-boilers, steam compressors. And the good thing is that those technologies are produced in Europe. So you are decarbonizing, you're bringing energy efficiency, you're developing industrial supply chain made in Europe, and this creates also the demand that is needed if we want to continue expanding the power system. So we have proposed a European Electrification Bank, which could include auctions at the European level to allocate competitively support in terms of CapEx and OpEx for some industry that would like to electrify their industrial heat, for example. Medium temperature, for instance, because it's easier at the start. And that would bring a very useful European layer also to discuss constructively on how to design the OpEx support in supporting industries in all regions of Europe. And you could plug it to an auction as a service system so that member states could top up with national state aid as well, but without having a huge discrepancy between what member states are doing. Third thing I wanted to mention is grids. And maybe looking more specifically at data centers. I mean, there was the AI summit yesterday in Paris. we see the grid connection issue as the main issue, actually. At least at the moment in France, we have lots of electricity, which is available, which is stable, and so we could offer it. But you need to be able to plug the data centers, but also the industrial sites, and that's the main problem because it takes 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and how to accelerate. So we think that indeed anticipatory investment would be good. Second, we need to get rid of this first come, first served approach in terms of demand connections. Why? Because in the list you have a bunch of projects which will never happen, first of all. Second, because some projects might be more needed even from a system standpoint or a societal standpoint at a moment in time. The Netherlands is already doing it. They started in October, a system where they are prioritizing, it's called, I don't know how, system supportive projects. So they are prioritizing demand side response, batteries in terms of grid connection. So I think this is a first example that should be picked up at the European level as well. As a start, we are doing what we can. We have identified 4 industrial sites which already have the connections and everything you need to put a data center or an industrial site with 2 gigawatts of available connection. And we're gonna do a call for interest in the next weeks. And we keep on identifying sites. That's on our own EDF real estate because we're the 3rd real estate manager in France. And so we've been working on really identifying sites and we're going to offer them to the market. And then, of course, there are commercial discussions going on the sourcing of electricity. I'm giving this example because I think that industry can also play its part and try to show the way and find solutions before all the regulatory framework is in place. But at the end of the day, we need an acceleration on the permitting. For industrial decarbonisation and, of course, for the grid connections that go with it.
Thanks a lot, Marvin. I would have one quick clarifying question back, that is, when you talk about the Electrification Bank, is that mainly for existing industries that want to go from fossil to electric? Or is that for everybody that wants to electrify, maybe even newcomers in the same sector?
Our initial idea was for industry that wants to electrify. So, for example, you're drying your sugar with gas heating system, and you want to switch to industrial heat pumps. That requires significant investment in terms of capex. And then for a period of time, you may need some OPEX support because the price of gas is lower than the price of electricity. Also because in France, by the way, the taxes on gas are 2 times lower than the taxes on electricity. So that's part of the equation. And so you could indeed have these sites willing to electrify, bidding in this type of system. Then it could be expanded if it works, but that could be a good starting point. I think the EIB would be very useful as well because on the capex side, sometimes you don't necessarily need a huge subsidy. You need, a guarantee or a system that will help the industry make this investment.
Yeah. What I particularly kind of picked up from your comments was on the first part in terms of coordination mechanism on the European level. I think what Christoph presented, this German study on 2045, I find it always fascinating that something like that exists, but it exists somewhat in a vacuum for one country, and it's not really coordinated with corresponding planning exercises in neighboring countries. And I think there is a substantial issue there if Germany assumes in a certain year to import certain amounts of electricity from one country and in another year expects exports to this country without this other country knowing about that. And I think we need to get better on this planning and modeling, but also on the political coordination side. And then some thought that came to mind from your presentation was that we have essentially different types of new electric demand that are coming up. We have the one that is more location fixed, like heat pumps and electric vehicles, which will be there where currently people are living and which we can relatively well predict, where we might have some opportunity in the sequencing, so when it comes in, and maybe there is some optimization in terms of sequencing and doing it first in some parts and later in other parts, depending on the supply side. And on the other hand, we have the locationally not yet fixed demand, which is industry to some degree, where the question is whether electricity intensive industries is going to sit exactly where the gas intensive industry used to sit, or whether there is some relocation within countries or within Europe, which makes it on the one hand more system friendly, on the other hand probably very difficult to predict from for modeling exercises. But let me maybe kind of give the ball back to Lukas with one question on the on this flexibility aspects that you already mentioned. So, do you think the tools that we have in the toolbox already and that you are working on will be sufficient to encourage new demand to provide the right amount of flexibility, or will you need to develop something on top? And then Christoph will also want to comment on that.
Yeah. Briefly, I think that we have already quite a few tools. I mean, the basic tool is the dynamic tariffs, right? And the other tool at a bigger level is the bidding zone setup, at least in a number of countries. Perhaps there is room for, and there is, by the way, the exercise of bidding zone review going on. But so there are tools like this. There are tools in the electricity market regulation related to pushing flexibility. And let's keep in mind that when we speak flexibility, that normally should be either storage or demand side response. And these should be compared on the basis of its virtues. But in many countries, the barriers that we see to the use of demand side response are still huge, right? Whether it's in the industry or for households. I mean, look at the level of the rollout of smart meters, for example, which are the precondition here. So a lot needs to be done in order to unlock this flexibility. I think that we should also look at whether different elements, let's say, of the electricity prices, are they stimulating flexibility enough? There is the price of electrons, but there are also network charges. Again, I mean, I hear the ideas about Electrification Bank, and there is definitely space for de-risking certain investments, but I really truly believe that with the right action on the taxes, with the right action on the charges, for example, with the technologies that we have, we can really go a long way in terms of electrification market-based.
May I push on one point on the network tariffication side? Will there be any action on the Commission side thinking about that, or?
There is a lot of thinking about that.
Okay. Christoph.
Let me double down on that one, because you mentioned we need flexible electricity demand, and I think we can all agree on that one. Actually, I think that electricity demand physically, fundamentally, might be much more flexible than the electricity demand we can observe today, and that is due to, let's say, biases and failures in market design. So think about industrial heat pumps or e-boilers, you mentioned them. Though industry needs a lot of heat, and during low price periods in summer when solar PV is abundant, it might well be possible to switch to electric production of heat instead of gas-fired fossil production of heat. But the single most important obstacle to that, barrier to that, is the grid tariffication system. So it's not that there are barriers, we actually incentivize inflexibility sometimes. So we have rules in force which incentivize in industries to consume at a steady level and not to react flexibly to price signals. And if you think about capacity prices in the network tarification system, for example, they are, again, an incentive to, let's say, reduce your maximum withdrawal from the system, more or less independent from the actual energy prices, because the marginal price for, let's say, increasing your maximum withdrawal from the system during a negative price period in summer will be huge because of the grid tarification system. And I think that there is urgent need to work on this, and I would very much welcome if there were some, let's say, European rules for that, because from my perspective, member states, they are increasingly aware of the problem, but they act much too slowly. And grid connections is another problem. So let me give you an example. We now just 2 weeks ago or something like that, there was an article in the major German magazine that German TSOs had, I think, 226 gigawatts of applications for battery storage systems, which seems to be a crazy figure. It's not so crazy if you understand that this application actually is a non-costly option. So you acquire, it has an option value, you acquire that option, you do not have to pay for it, and which results in let's say, companies which aim to build a battery storage somewhere to apply for network connections at various points, and then you have 10 gigawatts of applications, perhaps for 1 gigawatt of actual storage to be built. So if from these 226 gigawatt, 10% get built, I'm absolutely happy, but it shows that there is actually a need to overhaul the system of grid connections. It cannot work like that because grid operators do not really know how to deal with these numbers of applications and what the actual consequences of these should be and so on. So tarification and grid connections, it would be very, very important also from a European perspective to get better rules on that one.
Quick two-hander von Lukas, bitte.
Just one little phrase on exactly this. Germany is not the only country with this problem, and other countries have gone a similar route and addressed the issue of, fake grid connection applications. So I think there is a lot of space to learn from one another.
Okay. Before I pass to Pamela, one note to the audience here, but also online. We have a Slido so you can go to the website slide.do, and under the hashtag electricity, you can put in questions for later. I see there are already some questions from online that we will start to deal with in about 10 minutes. Pamela, on probably also on the question of grid connections.
I actually wanted to talk a little bit about what Lucas said with regards to flexibility. I think it's a hot topic. It's absolutely vital for us to meet our decarbonisation topics and targets, and I think it's incredibly important to think about it from a holistic point of view. A lot of us were talking about flexibility from when your demand response, balancing the system, ensuring that there is sufficient matching of supply and demand to reduce intermittency. I also think about flexibility from a location point of view. Where are you placing demand? Where are you placing generation? And that's also a factor that needs to come in mind when we're thinking about incentives to attract demand and resources to the right locations. I think I agree with your point when you're talking about aligning delivery costs that are like cost coincidental, and seeing how we can add more incentives to make flexibility on the ground and on the grid system match system-wide flexibility that's needed, because I do think there is some mismatch. When the wind's blowing, doesn't mean it's matched with what's congested on the grid at a substation level. And tariff design can do some innovative things with that. I'm hesitant to have too much regulation in that, because I also want to have adaptation so that in every location has different issues. And we need to make sure that there is some room for utilities to be innovative and to be able to adapt to the needs that they're facing locally, because it is changing in every region, and that's been our experience, at least as we're engaging globally. When we're talking about flexibility, I think it's really important that we think about value-based incentives and how we're valuing flexibility. Is it in line with like it's competing with other types of services? I think that's going to be really important, as well as ensuring that these resources are able to participate and that they're de-risks. We're talking about negative pricing, and that can be positive to stimulate, but if we're having too much flexibility in the system, I'm thinking wild here, then you're not going to have that negative pricing, and you're having a risky price like investment in a project. So we need to think about in the short term, as we're building out this robust flexibility playground, we need to make sure that there is mechanisms to de-risk those investments as well. And obviously on connection reforms, getting rid of zombie or speculative projects are really important, and we're seeing many countries looking at different ways about how to prioritize and improve processing. And I think a role that could be really helpful at the EU level is, as you mentioned, providing guidance and platforms for regulators and grid operators to share their learnings so that we can harmonize and align how they're addressing this issue across the EU. Because there is a knowledge gap. I am seeing that it's a huge undertaking, and finding ways that they can get information and best practices without having to reinvent the wheel in every member state will be really helpful.
And I presume it would be probably quite helpful if also consumers that are active in different parts of the EU participate to share a bit what they're thinking about the different regulatory systems are. I mean, I would have one maybe technical question if I may. Having different data centers in different parts of Europe, would there be an option to do some load shifting between those data centers depending on locational kind of scarcity situations, and would that potentially call for some more harmonization of tariffication in order to not get misaligned incentives?
Well, that's certainly not my expertise. I'm an energy expert, I'm not a data center expert. What I will say is that we're customer driven in where we attract load and where we invest. And I would like to kind of compare it to public charging. When you think about medium and heavy duty vehicles, roadside highway charging, when you invest in those systems, you need to have the service available so that you can attract customers and it's there when it's needed. So let's say you have a delivery truck, an Amazon package, for example, and they're charging that electric van so that you can get your goods on time, be it prescription medicines or a t-shirt. Having uncertainty about when that vehicle is going to be charged is not helpful for business and is not helpful for customers. And so we think about our data centers in that way, thinking about governments using our platforms and our data centers. We can't tell them when they can have access to their information. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a limit to flexibility. Okay, good. Then, I mean, zooming out a bit from the flexibility side before we come to the more broader question of overall demand in Europe, and the main challenge, and I think Christoph described it quite well, is that if we now overbuild the supply system, we might have a lot of capital that people will have to pay for, and that might mean quite high grid tariffs, quite high tariffs for the contracts for difference that we then put back on the electricity consumer, and essentially there is a risk of essentially kind of creating a sort of doom loop where we kill our own consumption through too high tariffs and like we potentially might see in the gas infrastructure. Is there any thinking on that there might be a role still for the state to kind of avoid this risk of having of tariffs exploding, fending off demand, and therefore leading to even higher tariffs? I don't know, Marion or Christoph.
I mean, if I look at France, for instance, there was a very interesting piece of work produced 2 years ago by the TSO with a very big consultation of the demand side, the production side. It's called Futur Énergétique, and they plotted how the demand and the supply could evolve in time, and that's a very holistic approach, which I think is useful in terms of projecting where we're going to go in terms of electricity demand and electricity supply. This type of approach allows as well to have a systemic approach and not a project by project approach. If I'm going to add an electrolyzer on the grid, for example, if the planning has been done in a way that we know that by 2030 there will be, 30 or 40 terawatt hour of demand for hydrogen production, and at least the system is going into this direction. Is it absolutely needed to have an additionality linked to that site? I think we've been looking at the system in a very project by project approach in the last few years with some of the legislation that was proposed, when maybe we need something that is more systemic in terms of approach.
Maybe can I push that a bit further to Christoph? So I see we do not really have, or at least I am not aware of a very good analysis of future electricity demand scenarios through in a cross-border sense. We have the work from the 10-year network development plan and the NSOE. The question there is that a completely neutral party to the assessment, because in the end they might be interested to see higher demand in order to justify more investments. So would there be a need to come to some more institutionalized electricity demand scenarios on a European level, or would you see any other option that national plans are being pulled together, or is that kind of just fantasy and doesn't make sense at all?
That's an interesting question and not that easy to answer. Actually, I think what we're doing now, so more or less compiling national trend scenarios in a lot of projects, always has the risk or bear the risk of some inconsistency, and so actually we're compiling a scenario with inherent tensions in it because it doesn't really work out. So I'd very much welcome, let's say, complementing these bottom-up scenarios by additional, more top-down scenarios which ensure consistency and all these, let's say, coherence across member states. Would not argue in favor of totally getting rid of the bottom-up scenarios. I don't think that's realistic. But complementing them with scenarios which aim at getting a higher consistency, but not being built up, let's say, from national forecasts, I think would very much help and could contribute. And perhaps with regard to your first question, so what would be the role of governments, let's say, in preventing that doom loop to happen or something like that? So in general, I think I'm quite hesitant to argue in favor of government intervention in prices. Nevertheless, we should be aware that RES expansion as well as infrastructure grid expansion often is driven by government decisions itself, and therefore, let's say, I think one could imagine that governments, let's say, provide some hedge to electricity price components stemming from government decisions originally, and I could imagine that, and that would be better than intervening with the short-term price mechanisms directly. So I would be very much in favor, if we want to stabilize something and prevent that doom loop from happening, then let's say to put let's say at least a soft cap on these components. But we should also aim at having mechanisms which keep the costs limited there. So I had in my slides focus on valuable electricity production instead of the, let's say, bulk electricity production which does not have any value. I think that should be a guiding principle for support schemes in the future, and it is not today completely. Same goes for grid expansion. So I think we need those anticipatory investments or anticipatory planning at least. But today we treat, let's say, grid expansion projects as more or less atomic projects. So we start working on them, and then we complete them as soon as the permits are received. I think we should think more about a strategy where we acquire permits, get some work done, and spend the money. So building a transmission line doesn't really take much time. So it takes 1 or 2 years or something like that. What really takes time is getting the permits. So getting the permitting done in case scenario should materialize would really help, and should not imply that we will have to build the line at each and every cost, even if it's no longer needed when we get, or when uncertainties are reduced. I think there are the measures to reduce the costs here that actually need to be borne by consumers, but then some stabilizing of government-induced price components might be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Good. Now, with that, I would like to open the floor. I would like to ask you kindly to introduce yourself and to try to stick as close as possible to the topic of the session. So, Nico.
Thank you. Nicholas Koma, you're active. Lukas, in your introduction, you mentioned interconnection as a priority target for the Commission, but has it not been the Parlement that has been lenient in enforcing the 15% rule in Europe? And Mr. Maurer, just to follow up on, are you arguing in favor of anticipatory permitting instead of anticipatory investments to sort of avoid the ghost pylon issue?
I would take 2 more questions. Any in the room? Okay, there's one there first, and then a second.
Hello, I'm Abhi from Electric. So I work as an analyst there. So thanks for the presentations and the discussions. So one thing, when we talk about electricity demand, maybe what I found a bit lacking in the discussion is the take-up of this demand. Because when we look about the future electricity demand, major demand is gonna come from the transport sector, majorly EVs and the heat pumps. But finally, consumers have to buy EVs, and consumers have to install EVs, install heat pumps at their houses, right? So what actions we can take, to kind of accelerate this uptake? Maybe this was, I found it a bit missing in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. And then there was the gentleman there.
Thank you very much for the talk. I have a question regarding the future of electricity demand related to data centers. And that is, I'm wondering whether there's some sort of natural limit to the amount of data that you collect, and therefore the electricity that you will require for efficiency reasons, or is it just more and more and more? Or is there some sort of limit where at one point it just becomes more costly and less efficient to collect more and more data to pump into these data centers to get better and better algorithms? So at one point I guess the question is about whether your efficiency progress in terms of the algorithm from the data will mitigate the increase in electricity demand that you have from the data centers.
Good. Who wants to start? Maybe Lukas got the first question. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and I'll start with grids. What I'd say is that in Parliament or in Brussels or in the Commission, we've been pushing the interconnectors, as you know. This said, the interconnectors are not being built by the Commission, right? I think this is pretty crucial to the reply of why in certain member states on certain borders the level. By the way, 15% that's for 2030, no? So, but you are right that the progress on certain borders is clearly not sufficient. So I would say that first, you can expect in this mandate more focus on interconnectors. But the second thing that I already mentioned and I would like to stress is that you will see more focus on the expansion, modernization of, in particular, distribution grids. And this, in my mind, is something pretty new, no? Traditionally, we were focused at the EU level at transmission lines, big interconnectors. The distribution grids were behind the curtain of, subsidiarity. It has changed. I think that now you have a common understanding around the table that this is where the challenge is for the whole system, and this is where we need to kind of sit together, learn from each other, finance certain critical investments at the level that in the past would have been considered local. Thanks.
If you want me to talk about the data center one, I'm happy.
Yeah,
I'm happy to address it. I think I first want to talk about energy efficiency, and as I mentioned in the opening, we are 4 times more efficient than on-premise DCs, and we're continuing to try to improve that efficiency. Similarly, when it comes to impact, we are matching our consumption with renewable energy globally, and we will continue with that. I think the main issue with load growth is not agnostic to data centers. It's more about how fast and where we're growing. And we're being a lot more thoughtful with communicating our needs and our scale ambitions with grid operators so that they can build and we're not having a negative impact on the system. And so when you think about it, we're being more energy efficient. We are procuring the renewable energy to power our DCs so that we're not having an impact on other customers. And we're also being a lot more thoughtful with sharing, and that brings up the coordinated grid planning aspect that you mentioned before, and that, Christoph, you've mentioned for anticipatory investment. I think the scale of demand is evident that it's coming, but it's not unusual for just this sector. If we want to be competitive, we need to build to need. But how do we do that in a way that's smart? And that's where we need to be more partners and more collaborative with regulators, with grid operators to ensure we're right-sizing the system. And we're also incorporating these kind of aspects in planning. I know you mentioned, Christoph, that you want to kind of continue with the top-down and bottom-up planning. What I like, and an example of that I was a part of, was the New York Coordinated Grid Planning process, which does that. And it's very strategic about where they pre-invest in the energy system from an anticipatory point of view. They identify projects that are hot spots for grid investment so that they can preemptively invest there. I'm less concerned about the demand growth and more with the pace with which we can match it. And that's where we need to be a bit more nimble and innovative with where we invest and how we unlock some of these barriers, such as permitting. And something that wasn't brought up today that's on my mind regularly is supply chain issues. If we are pre-investing in the energy system, how are we ensuring that there are transformers available so that we can get those projects going? And with regards to anticipatory permitting, I think there's a lot of ways that you can overcome permitting. Some things can be green zones. It can be streamlining the process. But it's something that you really need to have active coordination with government agencies so that they can anticipate this and streamline it. And I see a lot of innovative things coming forward, but I think education is key, understanding, and having all parties on board to find solutions together.
Yeah, maybe jumping on Abe's question. We've had in France a social leasing system for electric vehicles, which worked quite well for a while. What we see is that when there are many changes to the schemes, it gets more complicated for consumers to find their way out in the different stop shops that you have. So what we can do as a company, for instance, on heat pumps, is to do all the applications for the subsidies. So that's what we do when the consumer wants to buy a heat pump. Then we do all the applications to collect the national subsidies, whatever regional fund, etc. And we top up. So for each heat pump that the customer wants to buy, we top it up, the support schemes, with up to 1,000 euros. So that would bring down the price of a heat pump between 3,000 to up to 6,000 euros for a household which would have less revenues. But of course, I mean, if you compare that to the cost of a heat pump, which is more between 10,000 and 15,000, there is still quite a substantial investment to be done. So maybe we should be discussing more with the banks as well on what kind of systems could help consumers to invest, because there is a significant capex investment effort to be done at the beginning. So as companies, we do as much as we can, of course, but that needs to be matched with some stability and clarity in the schemes as well.
Briefly.
Add on the question of interconnection. I think there is actually some headroom for improvement here in coordinating European-wide interconnection or planning and national planning. So if I look at the German network development plan process, actually they take the projects from the TYNDP and they question them again from a German perspective. So looking at the benefit for German consumers, which obviously does not necessarily need to align with let's say socioeconomic welfare on EU level. So I'd be very much in favor of a, let's say, closer linkage between European and national plans there, and somehow making a project which was identified as a project of common interest on European level, let's say mandatory or at least some kind of default for national planning, and limiting the possibilities to question that project again in national grid planning. And another issue, and I think that fits well with your latest publication, Georg, is about, let's say, sharing costs and benefits for interconnection projects. To me, that is one of the major issues which has to be resolved over the next years. So obviously there is all energy modeling studies see huge value in interconnection. That long-term scenario study I presented to you, it calculates about, if I remember correctly, roughly 90 gigawatt of interconnection for Germany in 2045, which is a huge amount compared to today's levels. So it would have to triple roughly, And here it becomes obviously very important what Georg mentioned some minutes ago. It really doesn't help if a German study calculates that from a German perspective 90 gigawatts of interconnection would be optimal if nobody else knows about that and deals with that in national plans. So getting that socioeconomically efficient level of interconnection is a huge task, and it requires some allocation, cross-border allocation of costs and benefits. And that can only be done on EU level. And it needs some intelligent solutions. And I think you were arguing for some kind of EU fund in your paper, and I've been doing that for many years, because I don't think that today's mechanism, let's say, of trying to identify the costs and benefits and then slicing that fixed pie among the project or the parties to the project really works. And I think I don't see any evidence that it really works, and that is a major challenge. And I would very much welcome, let's say, some smart ideas on European level how to deal with that, because we will need that efficient level of interconnection, and it will be much higher than the level of interconnection we observe today.
Thanks for also mentioning the paper, and you can find it on the website if you like. I would like to almost close. I would have a last question based on a few comments on Slido, and I would put it to you, Lukas. And feel free to see what you would like to make of it. There was one question on industrial electricity demand in Europe, so what the expectations is there. There was another group of questions asking for cross-energy vector system planning and understanding how demand is there, and a third question on hydrogen. And for me, I would bundle them to a question essentially: do we have good visibility for policy making on a relatively kind of granular level of energy demand scenarios in Europe? So is what we can get from either primes or others, is this good enough for us to kind of do the policies that we kind of want to do as fact-based as possible, or should we kind of is there an analytical gap also for people like Christoph and a think tank like ours to do more analytical work on a granular understanding of the future of electricity demand?
I guess I will cut to the chase. I think there is space for short-term modeling. You mentioned Primes. Primes is working on 5-year steps, right? Good luck with granular picture on this. Primes is for certain uses, right? We are speaking about climate neutrality, and this is the perspective, let's say, in which we use the long-term modeling. For short-term, we have models, but I think that the challenge with trying to model the industrial electricity demand is that the industries are working on first are very flexible in terms of their own planning of investments, sometimes planning the investments, sometimes canceling the investments for different reasons. Second, they work on short-term time frames than for example, the grid planning. We had, at some point we had discussions with both the TSOs and the industry, and there are different times. Here there is a 10-year network development plan. On the other side, it's 2-3 years perspective, and again, it's pretty much changing, focused on the revenue, on the profit from the project. So I guess there is definitely space for more granular modeling, but I think there will also be this, the level of uncertainty how this all develops, and therefore I really like the idea of this kind of flexibility on the grid side in terms of taking steps, right? I mean, kind of verifying at each and every critical milestone whether the necessity of the costly infrastructure is there, and I would add to this whether this remains the best solution, because sometimes flexibility can be cheaper, right?
Yeah, then I think I got the answer that I wanted to have from you. Many thanks. What I would take home is electricity demand stays and increasingly becomes an exciting topic. We are, on the one hand, thinking about doubling our electricity demand. We think about having completely new sectors coming in to electricity demand. We might have other sectors that are potentially moving or reducing their electricity demand, and energy efficiency, also electricity efficiency, is in some areas reducing demand, while we have also completely new patterns of demand in temporal ways, for example with heat pumps that we didn't use to have before. So it is going to be not the world of your parents and grandparents in terms of electricity demand. It's going to be a new world to which we should really get a better understanding. My take would be that there is some analytical needs that are also maybe of interest to some of the more academic people that are listening here. And there is also some need for policy action to make sure that this synchronization on the supply, transmission, and demand side happens in a way that we don't have too much of wasted capital in a time where resources are, as always, very, very scarce. With these parting thoughts, I would like to thank you all for participating, and have a look on the website. Christoph, the slides can be put online. The slides will be put online, and hope to see you soon. And a great thanks to Connell that managed to bring this all together. Thank you very much.